Hi, thanks for joining us. I'd like to show you a technique for mat decoration that gives you the look of French matting, but in a much more up-to-date way, and one that really doesn't require a whole lot of learning new techniques or requiring a lot of specialized materials that it takes a while to learn how to use effectively. You've probably at least heard the term French matting, heard of it, and you've seen it even if you haven't really recognized what it is. A big feature of French matting is marbled panels, and this is strips of marbled paper applied to the face of the mat, and it's very often used on things like old botanicals and etchings and engravings. Although the one here on the left is a bit more of a modern piece there. And it's a really nice technique. It's great on traditional artwork, but honestly, it can be a little, let's say, matronly. So just to tell you a little bit about how the marbled panels are done, I'm just going to give you the quick version of it. Strips of marbled paper are cut and you apply a pressure sensitive adhesive to the back of it, and then they're applied to the mat with the ends crossing each other. And then it's cut across the corner where you see the yellow dotted line, and you would remove the excess from the piece that's on top. Then you would lift that piece up and remove that other piece that was cut off and put them back down and line up that miter very nicely snug against the other piece and burnish it down well. And this technique done traditionally does take quite a bit of precision. You have to make sure that all of the strips of the marbled paper are cut exactly the same width. It takes a bit of precision to get them placed exactly on the mat where you want them, and also in mitering the corners. But once it's done, you have something like this. Also, another thing that's found very often in French matting is a painted panel. And in this example, there's a painted panel around the mat opening that matches the frame. And there is also a fine gold line on either side of that panel. And that's a gilded bevel that you see there on an 8-ply mat. Now this is a sort of a newer way to do this, and as I mentioned, it's much easier. There's not much of a learning curve, and it doesn't require any sort of special materials or techniques. Most of them you probably already have in your store. And this is an example on an old vintage photograph. It still retains a lot of the old look with the colors and the marbled paper, but it can also be used on more modern work. This is a piece that Greg Perkins framed, and I believe he's also the artist. And it's a very modern frame, it's a very clean look, but it's still bringing in a little bit of that traditional look. And the paper that he used is very much in harmony with the artwork. And this is kind of a fun piece that Meg Glasgow did. And on this one, she has some paper with a giraffe pattern on it on this little print of Noah's Ark. It's a nice piece of artwork, kind of geared towards children, a little bit juvenile, and it's just a fun little touch there. And this technique can also be great for travel photos. This is a detail of some travel photos with a map of the area in there. And this could also be really good for things like a destination wedding or pictures of the couple on the beach where he proposed. Things like that, anything that's connected to a location, family vacation pictures. And it can also be applied to diplomas. This one is from Lionheart Framing. And on this one, This is a diploma from Georgia State University. It's located in downtown Atlanta and it's very much connected to its location. And in this open V groove is a portion of a map of Atlanta. And this is a really good way to kind of touch on the emotional aspect of artwork, including even a diploma. If you think back to your college days, you probably have a lot of memories of local areas and places that you liked to visit and hang out in around your college. In this case, there's probably somewhere on there is Ponce de Leon. And also, do you offer scanning and printing? If so, you can really do some nice, one of a kind, very, very custom things. For instance, on this picture here, I took the ribbon from the metal and I placed the metal and the ribbon on a scanner and just scanned it. I took it into Photoshop and spent just a minute just kind of increasing the contrast, touching up the color a tiny bit, and then printing it on some nice paper. And if you do offer scanning and printing, there it opens up a huge range of possibilities. For instance, this is some fabric that I scanned, and just as it is, it could work very nicely. Um, say a vacation picture from Hawaii. It can be a little bit strong in this case. It's a very strong color and pattern. But with some of these things, you could just take it and increase the lightness and decrease the saturation and get something like a sort of a watermark image that would be a lot more subtle. So basically what we have here, getting into the mechanics of it, is a double mat with an open V groove. And when you cut that open V groove, you end up with one piece that we'll call the top mat, a second piece that goes on the top layer also that we'll call the panel, and we put a piece of the decorative paper, the marbleized paper or what have you, inside that open V groove. And all of these designs really do require you to use a double mat because you have two pieces of mat board that are held together basically by a piece of paper, and there's just not much structural integrity there. So you do need to have a bottom mat there that they're attached to give it a bit more strength. And there's another option. You could work in a third color with a different colored panel on the inside. And to do this, you would just lay out your mat. You would cut the top mat twice in two different colors and use the panel from the second color. If you wanted the look of a single mat, like the Noah's Ark piece, then you could still do that, but just cut the bottom mat with sort of a negative reveal so that it's narrower than the top mat. And if you wanted to, you could put a reverse bevel on that bottom mat just to make it even more invisible. So here's what makes it so easy. It goes inside of that V groove, and rather than doing a lot of work mitering those strips of paper, you only have to cut one end of each piece of paper at a 45-degree angle. And it's a pretty forgiving process, so you don't have to worry too much about the precision of that 45 degree. And also, because you'll be cutting it a bit wider than the open V groove, you don't have to be as precise with that either, and it gives you a good amount of leeway. Because once it's done and in the mat, it's only visible inside that V groove, so those straight, nice, precise edges of the mat give you straight, precise edges to the marbleized paper. Now let's talk a little bit about the marbled papers. They are available in a tremendous variety of color combinations and patterns and designs. Once you start looking at them, you can really go down a rabbit hole. And these are some very traditional designs here. When I was talking to Denise, she noticed that the one in the upper right hand corner, the tan and gray, looks like wallpaper from 1978. So that could be good for some retro artwork there. And these are some long fibered papers. These have some inclusions in them, that sort of wispy, fibery look. The one on the left has a design in gold. These are some lace papers, and I have them both sitting on both a black and a white background to show you that they are very see-through with that design. And so just keep in mind that whatever mat that you're going to put them on is going to show through and will affect the color. In the upper right where you have the white on white, that could be a very, very nice subtle effect. These are some metallics. One applied almost at random, the other in a nice sort of swirly design. And this one called for a video because you really need to see how these look. The one on the right is almost sort of a holographic, and you see how it changes colors with the angle. And the one on the left is sort of a glittery look. Some of the papers are also available in different textures, like this one that looks like pink crocodile skin. You would just want to be careful with these because these with the heavy textures also tend to get a bit thick, and they can add a bit of bulk between the matte layers that you may not want. And there are many prints and patterns. Some of these may be better suited than others. The red and white geometric design in the upper left, you would have to be very careful with that one. Um, Cutting it and positioning it in the right way to get to the design and so that it looks straight. In fact, you might want to just avoid that one. The purple abstract flowers is nice, but just keep in mind you're only going to see a very small part of it, so the design may not come through very well. The red and gold is perfect. And you can even find some very, very thin wood veneers with a thin paper backing. These could be very interesting. These are from Hiromi paper. And I mentioned maps. Um, these could be a map that your customer provides you. You could find a map of the area that's needed at the local bookstore, or you could find them to download for free online, and you could print those. So here are some sources. These are all um, companies that I've either used myself or are kind of geared towards the framing and preservation industry, or ones that have been recommended. For maps, that's the one that I mentioned, the USGS. You can find any location in the United States to download and print at no cost. Now you're probably curious about the prices on these papers. Some of them are pretty exotic, but the prices actually are really quite reasonable. These three papers here are from Hiromi Paper, and they're $6 for a 20 by 30 sheet. This is the wood veneer that I mentioned, also from Hiromi, $260 for an 8.5 by 11. They also have 11 by 17, which is currently out of stock. This is some traditional marbled paper from Mulberry Paper and More. $6.25 for an 8.5 by 11, or about 18 for a 19.5 by 27. One thing you'll want to keep in mind with Mulberry Paper and More, they charge around $10 minimum for shipping. So you could end up spending more on the shipping than the paper itself. So it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to shop around a little bit and find a bunch of these pieces of paper that you really like to justify the shipping. I think that's probably what they had in mind. Uh, Hollanders, this is a beautiful piece of paper that I found at Hollanders, 650 for a 22 by 30. And keep in mind, you'll be cutting small strips of this, so one job will easily pay for a number of pieces of paper. And this is about as expensive as it gets. This one from Renato Crepaldi, $16 for 26 by 37. Um, these seem to be a very boutique sort of product, all literally handmade one at a time. Um, so you might expect the prices to be really expensive, but even then, it's quite reasonable. Okay, so the first thing that we'll need to do is cut the mat. Um, and this is the Wizard software. You might have a Valiani. Um, I'm showing the Wizard, but the steps and the process on the Valiani are going to be pretty similar. They may just have a different name and be in different places. So first you'll just lay out your opening just like you normally would, and then select Add V-Groove, and it will add it in, and you'll then go to the Properties tab, and over on the left make sure it's attached to the mat opening. And by default, it's a 0 width, which means it's a closed V-groove, a regular V-groove. When you go in and change that to anything other than 0, it's going to become an open V-groove. And generally, the minimum width that you can use is 3/16. Any narrower than that, and the blade starts to run into the mat, and it will nick it up and possibly jam up on you. So make sure that it's at least 3/16 of an inch wide. And there's also a template 801 that you could use that will get you to the same spot. And when you cut the mats, just be very careful to make sure you keep all of the pieces from the top layer. There's sort of a ring that will be cut out of the open V groove that you would normally throw away. Just be careful and hold on to it. Okay. Now you'll also need to cut some strips of the paper. And I'm showing a piece of wood grain here to really get the point across, because some papers have a bit of a grain, some directionality to the design, and you'll want to keep that in mind when you're cutting the strips. So in general, if you cut perpendicular to that grain, or that directionality, we'll call it, you end up with something like this, and it's going to look good. It gives you the most variation, and it really shows off the design best. Now you could cut it with the design, the grain running along the length, but as you see here, there's just not much variation, and it's not quite as interesting as it could be otherwise. Now, one thing that I would advise you definitely not to do is to cut on the diagonal. If you do this, you will regret it, because when it's put in the V groove, you're going to have all these diagonal lines, and nothing is ever going to look straight. It will be straight, but it will not look straight. It's an optical illusion. You may or may not recall, but about 20 years ago, Larson Jewell had a molding about an inch and a half wide that looked like fat rope with a very strong diagonal pattern to it, and everybody hated it because once it's on the wall, it never looked like it was straight. And if the mat was fairly narrow, then the mat opening always looked crooked inside the frame. So unless you're going for a very odd look, don't do this. Okay, so again, the strips, you're just going to cut one end with a 45-degree angle. And there are a couple of ways you could do that. One way is to just fold the paper over onto itself at a 90-degree angle and crease it. And when you open it up, you can just cut along the crease and you'll get a nice 45 degree. If you wanted to, you could use a 45 degree triangle like you might use in drafting or drawing. And something you might want to try is to tear some paper. Some of the mulberry kind of paper that has the long fibrous grain to it. You could tear that and get a nice feathered edge. And that way they just kind of blend right into each other. That could be a nice effect. Okay, so to put this mat together, you have all three pieces that you have saved. So just put them back together, and because you cut them on your CMC, they should fit together quite nice and precisely. And work face up, and put a piece of 3M 811 temporary tape across each corner. And for a smaller mat, that should be fine. On a larger mat, you might want to put a couple of additional pieces along the length of it. Then working from the back, put your ATG or your adhesive along either side of the open V-groove, which I've marked here in blue. And then position one end of the strip with the mitered corner across the open V-groove, going from corner to corner, which I've marked in red. And then on the opposite end, put a piece of release paper under it so that it doesn't stick quite yet. Because you'll next go to the next corner and put the next piece down with the 45 going across the corner. And then once you have that in place, you can place the straight end of the first piece of paper down and burnish it. And just work your way around, going in a pinwheel fashion, and then just trim the excess from the ends. And then attach your bottom mat and make sure that you place ATG or adhesive on both the outer and the inner portion, because you need to make sure that that inner part is attached to the bottom mat securely. And then just remove the ring from the open V-groove and that will expose your paper. The most difficult part here probably will just be getting that ring out. Feel free to take an X-Acto knife and just jab it in and pry it up to get it started. It's going in the trash, so you don't need to worry about it. And with that, your mat is done and ready to go on the artwork. Now, some of the paper is not going to be very large, say 8.5 by 11, or in the case of this paper here, it was 6 by 6 inch squares meant for origami. Now, that's not going to be very large, it's not going to be very useful, but you can work with it still, because there are some designs on your mat cutter that have elements that sort of interrupt the V-groove, sort of join that inner panel to the outer portion, and you can use those to hide the seams very effectively. And here's an example from Lionheart Framing. And in this case, it looks like they had some pretty large paper, but they just used this as a design feature. And they used two different types of paper, one for the long panels and then one for the corners. Now the painted panels, we can get something very similar to this using kind of the same technique. And a nice thing about it is that this technique, aside from being very easy, it will allow you to get this look using a fabric mat. And really, for all practical purposes, it's not possible to do a painted panel or these ruled lines on a fabric mat, but we can get a very similar, nice updated look. So you see here, it's very, very similar to what we've done before. Um, in this case, though, we're going to design the mat, and we'll cut the top mat twice, and we will use the top mat and the inner portion from one color and the inset, the ring, from the second color. So you'll just cut those two mats and then assemble all three portions together again and put the 811 temporary tape across the corners again. And you want to make sure that they're all three of those pieces are flush with each other. You don't want any of them sticking up proud from the other. So it's a good idea to use mats that are not only from the same manufacturer, but also from the same line. And that way you can avoid any small variations from one manufacturer or one type of mat to the other. And then just once you have them all together, flip them over and use the 810 permanent tape on the back, make sure you're running all the way around on both seams and burnish it well. Then attach the bottom mat and it's ready to go. Oh, and looky there. What do we have here? Well, stay tuned and we'll take a look at that. So I hope you've enjoyed this and gotten some good ideas. If you have any questions or feedback or any comments, just let me know. You know how to get in touch with me. Just give me a call or shoot me an email.